Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the warm introduction, and thanks everyone for joining from all over the world. We're living up to the Teal around the world when I look at the chat, so thank you. um, so I'm going to share my screen, and as I do, we'll anchor into the space together. There we go. Okay, so for my talk today, the purpose of the talk is just to share a story of how I've discovered, Teal and DAOs in my own experiences, and how much I think these two communities have to offer one another. And so the prompt of this in the format of the presentation is to kind of do a flyover of my own personal experiences, in this space or in these spaces, and to start to create the opportunity for us to discuss that together. And so one of the challenges when talking about organizations is just how complex they can be. And so we have two different communities and organizing styles and patterns and the things that influence them. And so I'm going to just gloss over a lot, particularly some of the technologies behind decentralized autonomous organizations. And so I want you to arrive as you are. You might be a DAO expert, you may be a Teal organizations expert, but if you aren't, that kind of brings me to my invitation for the space. And so
Bryan, I think you're still not in the presenters mode, but in the preview mode.
Am I in the preview mode? So
yeah,
there we go.
Yeah, perfect. Here we go.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, and so you're able to see invitations for the space now?
Yes, but it's again not in the presentation mode. It's funny.
Oh, you're seeing the speaking points. Let's try and figure out how to fix that. That's unfortunate. Something I wanted to test. So if I do this, what do you see?
It's still the preview.
You're still seeing the preview in the speaker's notes?
Yes.
Speaker notes. Okay. Darn, unfortunate. This is why I wanted to test.
But when we tested it,
do you want to send me the link? I can present and you can have the speaker notes.
I would appreciate that. Thank you for bearing with us as technology gives us a hard time.
Yes.
So, okay, here we go. And I'm going to share the link. Anyone with link, copy link, and I'm going to throw it into the chat if that's okay. Thank you. Unfortunately in the chat, I'm stuck on direct messages. So I'm going to share it over Discord. Does that work for you, Travis?
Yep, that works for me. Can somebody make me co-host so then I can share?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, you're a co-host now, Travis.
Excellent. Bryan, I'll get it up and share in just a second. It's just loading the Discord for me over here.
Thank you. No, I appreciate it. And just thanks for the accommodation on the fly and for everyone for your patience. So.
Yes. Wonderful.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Okay. And I am now in. So if we could go to the invitations for this space slide, just after the title slide. All right, so given that preamble, I want us to spend some time asking questions about anything you feel curious about. Embrace the confusion that might be here as a result of my slides, despite their best effort, as an opportunity to ask a question. Consider that no one present, myself included, is neither a Teal nor DAO organizational expert. So with that invitation and preamble, I want to tell, next slide, please, Travis, a Teal love story. And so I first read Reinventing Organizations and learned of Teal organizations at a time where I was an executive manager of a rapidly scaling tech company. And so I'd felt a pretty strong tension with this sort of haphazard ascension up a management ladder in this organization at this point in my career. once upon a time, it had been a really flat startup who loved using self-managing techniques like Agile to rapidly change direction and share power. But, as things scaled, they started to sacrifice these values in favor of predictability, control, and in doing so, they added in a managerial hierarchy and actually kind of scaled that managerial hierarchy quite rapidly, adding multiple layers to it. And so I was promoted into these management positions as the organization grew. And honestly, I felt more and more useless with each of those promotions. I often found that I was most satisfied when I became completely irrelevant and my team didn't need me. But this was often when I was typically promoted into a new role, only to repeat this struggle. And so along the way, this haphazard career journey, I couldn't quite put my finger on what this tension was that I was feeling, and the dissatisfaction I had in comparison to those early days of this startup. And after I read Reinventing Organizations and I learned about what a truly self-managing team and organization looks like, it made it viscerally clear what I felt was missing and why I struggled to find meaning in these new managerial positions. And the core of the conflict for me personally was that I was being placed into a position of power over my peers when all I really wanted to do was just work with them. And so if we go to the next slide, I dove deeper into Teal organizations, pulling on this thread. And as I immersed myself into the community surrounding it, I loved what I saw and what I felt. But I struggled to believe that these beautiful concepts could break out in the niche and really scale globally. And I often found when I had these kinds of conversations and I was open about it in the community, others would sense into this and feel this too. I was curious about some of the limitations. And so this overly complex slide is a bit of a brain dump of what I personally came up with along that journey. And so a Teal organization often rests upon legacy power structures. The real power in an organization often exists at the ownership layer, and it is benevolently given over to the organization that wishes to go Teal. So that's a common pattern. But this is actually empowerment, not real power transfer in a lot of these cases. And it can be taken away. And I noticed when I dialogued with others in the space that this was a common failure pattern in a Teal organization. It would be wonderful and working, and then something would happen. And then that would be pulled back. In the communities I now play in the crypto and blockchain space, they call that a rug pull or getting rugged. And this was one way in which that can happen in a Teal organization that I observed. Another challenge I noticed was that even if the power remains situated in the organization, most Teal patterns required that all the participants in the network follow the agreements they've made with one another about how they're going to interact, behave, organize, and collaboratively do whatever it is the purpose of the organization is. And if they don't do that, though, and sometimes all it takes is one person, the system can regress quite rapidly back to legacy patterns, or sometimes something worse. Because what's happening here, what I felt in some of my experiences and noticed in when calibrating with others, is that the trust is fragile. And it requires people to stick to those agreements. And each person added to this network enhances the risk that it crumbles. So there are a few examples of large Teal organizations, that are very inspirational. And they can remain Teal for long periods of time, which is amazing. But there's sort of a lot of work to participate in a Teal organization as it grows. And as my friend Edwin from the IMG group describes it, it's a real journey of transformation for each member, starting with one's head, following with one's heart, and then eventually with one's habits. And so as we grow a Teal organization, there's a lot of work that needs to be done by each participant to try and keep this alive as it scales. And so these are some of the symptoms, and maybe you have some of your own, of things that I noticed when it came to the challenges of scaling Teal. So the next slide. As I contemplated this problem, it became clear that the tools we use matter. And Conway's law became a useful muse for me in these contemplations. So Conway's corollary states that the way teams organize themselves and communicate will trend towards matching the tools they work with and the systems that they build. So if we're using traditional capital markets, corporate legal entities, corporate governance structures, establishing trust using banks and lawyers as intermediaries, then it's a bit of an uphill battle, in my opinion, to try to overcome all of that inertia of that machine and embrace the unique gifts of Teal, in a way that sticks. And so these tools that we're using, and these patterns that we're using at the base of our organizations really matter. And, we need to choose tools that attract energy. And when I say energy, I mean in the form of money and talented and energized people. There are many ways in which a community or organization can accumulate energy. And we have to attract that energy that's aligned to sort of the values or conditions of Teal. In order to do this, we have to use tools that naturally reinforce this, hold it together at true scale without a tragedy of commons emerging, like I described in the previous slide. So on to the next slide. Here I'm showing sort of that classic technology adoption or technology transformation curve. As someone who started a career as a mechanical engineer in the passenger rail industry, I've seen the power of technology innovation curves can have on organizing patterns in this, Conway's Law corollary as discussed previously. So in the rail industry where I was working, which is like a poster child for the Industrial Revolution, they use a lot of waterfall project management techniques. And it's where, in this case, there's like a centralized office, often referred to as an ivory tower of project managers that get to decide how everyone's going to be working. And so I watched in the second phase of my career when I was in that Silicon Valley funded tech company, how the internet as a technology changed how people were working together. The agile movement or the agile software movement made teams much more self-organizing. The technology itself was influencing the way in which software developers wanted to work with one another. And this agility, though, I noticed from that past experience I described, seemed to be interrupted as soon as it tried to interface with the brick wall of executive management and corporate governance at the company. And so around 2017, as a believer in this interesting relationship between the evolution of technology and the evolution of our organizing patterns, I became curious if a new technology was emerging to change our current post-internet era patterns. So soon after this point in time, I stumbled into blockchains and the promise of decentralized autonomous organizations, or sometimes affectionately referred to as DAOs, their acronym. It's funny how serendipity, kind of just does its thing. I was curious about this, and all of a sudden my feed of life is starting to show me, blockchains and DAOs. So as shown on the screen, I've started to believe that blockchains and DAOs will create a shift in the way in which we organize, and that the shift looks a lot like the patterns of Teal organizations. And this was really exciting for me. So next slide, Travis. The conditions of Teal are present in DAOs. Okay. As I immersed myself in the space of blockchains and DAOs, I started to have lived experiences that showed that the conditions for Teal had kind of naturally emerged inside these communities. And at this time, I was also meeting with friends who were Teal practitioners and sort of calibrating these experiences with them. And so I started to notice the conditions of Teals are present. The first being self-management. DAOs naturally formed a network of self-organizing autonomous teams when I was in them. There are no bosses, traditional org charts aren't present. They achieve distributed decision-making using blockchain-based governance techniques. I'll kind of gloss over that a little bit later, but they're using these technologies and blockchains are inherently transparent. So all the information flows were open, another key attribute noticed by Lulu when looking at self-management in Teal organizations. And since there aren't managers or centralized authorities, a lot of the disputes were being resolved using these same distributed decision-making patterns, that were the primary decision mechanica in the DAO. And so the other was evolutionary purpose. Teal organizations live for their purpose and will view anyone moving towards that purpose as an ally and will collaborate, not compete. And in the blockchain networks, these natural collaborations emerge because these are open technologies and they're often knitted together without requiring, things like a non-disclosure agreement or joint venture agreements or mergers and acquisitions. See, because of this open tech ecosystem, if it's fit for purpose, I've noticed it is very natural for decentralized autonomous organizations and their underlying protocols to just start working together and sharing resources. And so there's this evolutionary purpose and collaboration at play. They just sort of evolve into one another. And the last one is wholeness. This one kind of surprised me because actually I was a skeptic going into DAOs because I'm not a video game player, and I hadn't participated in joining, the classic large open space video games where, people describe that they make friends all over the world playing as an avatar. And so this was new and interesting for me, but I found a surprise. I thought, hey, if I'm not showing up as myself with my face on the screen and declaring that I'm Bryan Peters, who lives in Ontario, Canada, like I'm not bringing my whole self, was the sort of naive thought I had. But in DAOs, people often participate under a pseudo-anonymous profile. I personally go by BPeats. I have an avatar with a pink hoodie and 3D glasses. It's just kind of how it naturally happened. But because we show up with our we show up with our real world identity, somewhat opaque, some really interesting behaviors emerged. They were completely predictable for those who play video games, but they were new to me. I watched DAOs naturally form peer-to-peer meetups to discuss their experiences with addiction in voice calls. Really, really large groups of people showing up and supporting one another with their experiences. I heard stories of people who identified as belonging to minorities feel unusually comfortable taking risks as they reflected on their early experiences in participating in a DAO. They talked about how their integration community, they felt safer knowing that they didn't have to reveal anything about their identity, which was obvious in other interactions of their life, until they felt comfortable doing so. And they often did down the road, and found wholeness in a progressive fashion, but also felt like they could bring all of themselves and not guard or shield. And so these kinds of conversations gave me goosebumps, honestly, when I was talking to people and experiencing small elements of it myself. And so I think there's seeds of safety in some of the ways in which DAOs are working together in these digital online environments with pseudo-anonymous names and profiles. And so next slide, Travis. I'm just going to take a second and say, okay, cool. I'm saying, these conditions for Teal are met, and I'm telling you some, snippets of experiences from my life, but, maybe take a step back and I'll introduce some of the technologies and why, as I presented earlier, I believe that, Alec Conway's corollary, that these blockchain technologies kind of have properties designed in that naturally reinforce that those who work with them have a tendency to start to embrace Teal-like patterns. So let's take a look at blockchains for a second, and I'll assume that this is a 101 for each of us. Apologies to those who have done some deep dives themselves. So I've shared that I believe blockchain technology naturally generates those conditions for Teals. But how does it do it? What is a blockchain doing? I mean, I like to think of a blockchain as just a trust machine. It's code that's been written to try and generate trust amongst a large number of folks across the globe. And so how does this do this? Well, it reinforces the rules by forming consensus together. At the end of the day, blockchain is a consensus algorithm, and all of the participants in the network are the node operators, or the nodes in the network. This is sounding a little familiar to Teal, right? Like we're all nodes in a network organization, forming agreements together and checking those agreements together. And that's exactly what's happening in a blockchain. As a change of state, be it a transaction or some event is proposed, AKA a block, the algorithm kicks in and the node operators check this new proposed block. And they each, as you can see in my diagram here, there's a history of events of all of the previously agreed to things, so the previous agreements in the network. Each and every node operator is keeping a copy of those prior agreements that have been formed. So as a new block is being proposed, they're checking whether this block is a valid block based on that shared history. And each one of them comes in and forms consensus. And there's some incentive mechanisms that I'm just going to gloss over that, incentivize the node operators to come in, participate, and do a good job. But they're checking one another and forming consensus. And there are enough nodes in the network with all having that shared history and checking together that they can protect against bad actors in the system, trying to attack the system or to maliciously say something different or form a different truth or pretend the history of agreements was different. And so they're all checking each other and forming consensus, and you end up with a bit of a trust machine because of all these nodes working together, kind of like when a Teal organization is high functioning, all the nodes are working together to uphold the agreements and that shared history they have of the rules of how they're going to operate. And so, initially in 2008, this new technology was used to tackle an interesting trust problem that's become famous for, which is the currency problem. Currency requires a lot of trust. And Bitcoin was born used blockchain technology to generate a trusted fabric on which to birth a currency, a fully digital currency, one where we can trust that people are not going to double spend the coins, and the blockchain and these node operators are checking the records of who holds what currency, how it's been transacted and flowing around the system, and making sure that they are valid transactions and that we are not double spending the coins or inventing new coins. And there's sort of a high incentive to attack this as well, right? Because if you can get the coins, then you can enrich yourself as a nefarious node operator. And so it's a great test of the resilience of a blockchain and its purpose of being a trust machine. So it does all of this without the use of nation states, banks, or other forms of external intermediaries to generate trust. So, and we trust this machine as those who start to participate come to understand the properties of this machine and how it generates trust. Okay, so it's a fascinating starting point, and I barely scratched the surface, and I probably butchered it for those who are more technical than myself. But the next evolution in the next slide is what really unlocks the potential for new organizational patterns. So if we go to the next slide, we're going to talk about smart contracts. And this was the next element of the technology innovations, in my opinion, on blockchains. Basically, it started to make, smart contracts started making blockchain technology more programmable. So instead of the blockchain being purpose-built to mimic a currency, as was the case with Bitcoin, you could make a blockchain act more like a programmable, global, decentralized computer. It's not owned by Amazon. It's not owned by Google. It can't be manipulated by Twitter execs. It is just a decentralized computer that the nodes are participating in to produce a public good. And so it's a fancy way of saying a computer we can trust that we can form agreements on, because the smart contracts start to make this blockchain and its properties of trust more programmable. So we can form smart contract agreements, code them into the blockchain, and that's an agreement now that the node operators will watch and ensure is enforced as new interactions occur with this blockchain. And so we get this trust. And we get this trust without, intermediaries. Typically, when we form contracts today, even in the age of the internet, we've got lawyers or trusted parties acting as intermediaries between parties who may not trust each other, who want to try and work together. So an interesting example of this, is a smart contract I've seen used in DAOs to speak to that evolutionary purpose and collaborating instead of competing. An interesting example is a revenue split agreement. The diagram I've shared here has two parties that deploy a smart contract, agreeing if the funds are moved to an address known by the revenue split agreement, that those funds will be automatically split on the terms that are programmed in. So they've programmed in the terms that any monies that flow in to this agreement on the blockchain will produce a 40% flow to account A and a 60% flow to account B. There is no need for a trusted party to receive the funds and escrow them, as is typical, or be trusted to receive them in their account and then share them with the partnered account. It happens all programmatically by the nodes enforcing the rules of the blockchain and this smart contract that has been deployed there. So now we're getting into some interesting stuff with smart contracts, and we're going to start to see the foundations of what has formed these decentralized autonomous organizations. To the next slide, we're going to talk about decentralized capital formation. When something is starting, it needs to gather energy, as I mentioned earlier, and one of the more powerful forms of energy is shared capital. And so the real magic, happens when these smart contracts can be used to raise capital. In fact, this was the major innovation of the 2017 initial coin offering boom that created a pretty large and bubblish cycle of innovation and scams in 2017. But this was the mechanic. Decentralized capital formation happened. And there's some interesting things about the smart contracts that they programmed to generate trust. So this fundraising smart contract, if you added capital, you would receive tokens that were governance tokens to participate in the endeavor of governing that shared capital that we pooled together. But these smart contracts got a little bit clever and said, hey, how can we really trust each other? Even though there's this smart contract here and you got your tokens, like, how do we know that once we all start working together, we're actually going to, keep oriented to the purpose that brought us here? So they, started to bake in a property to these fundraising smart contracts of the right to exit. This is a moment where I felt that sort of like Teal heartthrob thing going for me. And so, the right to exit ensures there's no coercion. So if at any point, the same smart contract, I can put my 100 tokens back in and receive my pro rata return in the capital because perhaps I'm no longer feeling energetically aligned to the endeavor and the reason I gathered in the first place. And so this allowed groups to trust each other because they knew that this machine would give them back their funds if it wasn't going the direction that they were originally inspired that it would. And so next slide. Aside from capital formation, we've got decentralized governance. And one of the most important agreements is deciding how we decide when we're forming an organization that wants to share power. And so this decentralized autonomous organizations at their heart is often the governance contract, deciding how we decide in a versatile way. And so that also allows for an evolving organizational purpose. I've seen these governance contracts, used to do co-budgeting, to move funds into smaller autonomous teams to get, a particular aspect of the mission or purpose fulfilled, and other self-managing patterns have been observed. It's really just a simple if this then that machine, though, often, or a simple voting machine. So if 60% of the token holders said, yay, we consent to this, and 80% of the token holders voted, the smart contract is programmed to execute whatever the parameters were that were put into the smart contract. So I propose we move some funds to this autonomous team's address so that they can go do this thing because they're the right small team to do it. Does everyone agree? We can also change the governance thresholds themselves or the governance contract itself and change the shape of how we govern. If we find this decision-making mechanic isn't working for us as a first experiment, we can send tokens to addresses plus many other things that can happen. The sending tokens to addresses is really interesting because often that was a way to retroactively honor contributions to the network that were non-monetary in form. And I think that's a really important and powerful mechanic that was often in the case of these decentralized governance. Hey, I noticed so-and-so's contribution. I would like to recognize that they have more governance power, regardless of what capital they brought. They brought unique gifts. So on to the next slide. We're starting to see a bit of a fuzzy image of the mechanisms related to blockchain that can empower these decentralized autonomous organizations to form and start to make decisions together. So I'm just going to tell a really quick story of why this is pretty special and magical, in my opinion. I had an experience of watching a young man by the name of Scott on Twitter declare that a Wyoming DAO LLC law had been passed. And this person wanted to run an experiment of understanding, could we own land as a DAO and as a decentralized network of people in a compliant way with this new law? And what could we do with it? Could we start to propose interesting ways to use that land in alignment with the values of those who had gathered on this mission together? And so a simple tweet gathering people to buy some artwork that was a membership token, raised close to 3 million and had close to 5,000 people across the globe in mere days. As time went on, they started to propose with the governance mechanics, teams that were going to explore this purpose and this mission. They eventually, in less than 6 months, had purchased a parcel of land in Wyoming, had some really interesting plans for it, had fractionalized the governance of it using non-fungible tokens or NFTs. And they had done all of this together on the instigation of a tweet and the trust that they were able to bring through these smart contracts, and the blockchain is a substrate reinforcing that trust over time. So going to the next slide, though, all great things cast a shadow, and this is where I'll end, my speaking portion of things today. You can't code everything. Blockchains are amazing at doing some pretty interesting and primitive things that can help bring humans together across the globe, like nodes on the blockchain network, to go after a purpose-oriented thing with a lot of energy in a short period of time using that code. But we can't gracefully code something as complex as a human organization all the way down. And as a result, DAOs need to be better at using human trust. They showed up so excited about code that in many cases, they do not yet have the experiences and the unique gifts of working in a decentralized, self-organizing team, like many Teal, practitioners have in their own experiments, in their own organizations and communities. And so there's a unique opportunity here. I hope I've proven that there's overlap between these communities, and there's some unique gifts that those who have been experimenting in the Teal space could actually bring to these teams where code can't, isn't fit for purpose. Another is token weighted governance and some of the shadow sides of that. In these networks, money can buy power, and sometimes games get played where money can start to buy governance power on open exchanges. And you get this sensation of almost like hostile takeovers or plutocracies, $1, one vote kind of thing. And, DAOs have been struggling to figure out how to create governance models that aren't as easily captured, better represent the humans that have gathered, and not just their money or their sweat equity contributions. And but some of the challenges that exist here technologically to sustain some of the other values that I mentioned earlier that bring unique gifts like pseudo-anonymous participation, you have to worry about Sybil attacks, think bots on Twitter and all the other problems that exist in the internet world. So they're really struggling with this right now. But for the places where they can't use code, there are a lot of beautiful patterns like the advice process, forming consent that those in the Teal community could bring in the interim, and that those would inspire potentially digital ways to recreate or enhance some of these patterns to get beyond token weighted governance. And the other is they're really good at propagating a structure. So they form energy in people and ideas and capital, and they even very quickly propagate structure with these proposals and these governance mechanics, but they often then struggle to activate this beautiful structure that they create. It's very top down initially, forming that structure. And there's an opportunity, I think, looking at those who have been Teal practitioners, there's a lot of bottom up stuff that occurs in a Teal organization, bottom up governance patterns. And, I think that there's an opportunity to bring some of those patterns to DAOs so that once they've got this thing that they've propagated top down so rapidly, they can start to embrace more of these bottom up methods and leverage this beautiful structure and the talented individuals within it faster and more effectively. And so that takes me to my next slide, which is basically, what do you wish to learn? Because I tried to cover a fair bit in a short period of time about these organizations and their overlaps of Teal, but what do you wish to learn in order to maybe take the first step towards sharing your unique gifts with decentralized autonomous organizations, or getting curious and taking a first step? And so I bring back to the invitation for this space as the next slide and say, what questions do you all have? And what are you curious about? What did I say that caused confusion with my word salad and, spider web diagrams on slides?
Thank you so much, Bryan. Wow. I'm quite impressed, and I think I really learned a lot today about tokens and Bitcoin and how everything is related to it. Yeah, great story. And I think we had so far a very lively chat, but no questions in the Mentimeter. But I think we can just stay on the chat, and maybe the group is we have 24 people. Maybe we can also let people unmute. So what I can see, there were discussions about building trust, but on the other hand, also that war, sex and crime is coming up, and yes,
Sorry. I mean, I threw in a footnote to the underbelly of the things that have happened in this space, but yeah, that hits the nail on the head.
Yeah, and I think, yeah, how would you comment on this? I mean, how does this fit to building trust? And I think, yeah, I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, it's a beautiful one. I'm happy to start there because it's sort of it's the elephant of the room, or as Lisa would say, the moose head. So let's go there. I think in history, when innovative technologies emerge, and I don't want to be complacent about this or blasé about it, they often find utility first in niches, and sometimes those niches that have found utility are those who have been ostracized from the mainstream in some way, shape, or form. And so that can be both beautiful, and that can be also a bit of a shadow side. It's one that I didn't mention. And it's because, those who are trying to find loopholes or involved in, sort of criminal endeavors or endeavors that are ostracized in some way by mainstream banking or laws, even if it's in a sort of like subtle way and not a very direct way, they often gravitate to new technologies that might give them the means to do what is their purpose or their objective. And so this is a common pattern, as I mentioned. It happened during the birth of the internet. There was a lot of jokes around how the start of the internet was basically driven by porn and the porn industry, and some interesting stories related to that. And in the case of programmable money, the biggest challenge has been money laundering and illicit uses of money, avoiding laws related to money. So for example, the Silk Road and the drug trade that was done digitally using Bitcoin in the early days of Bitcoin is something that commonly comes up. The North Korean hacks that happen within the ecosystem, and then how that's used to launder money into anonymous accounts and enrich the treasuries of those that some nations declare shouldn't receive large amounts of capital. OFAC in the United States, for example, was pretty upset about that one and started to ban smart contracts that are coin mixers that are purposely built to create privacy and anonymous transactions, and said, hey, these folks over here are using this. And OFAC as an organization said that they literally created a very interesting and new precedent of putting a smart contract address on the OFAC ban list. And so this is just a product of these new technologies. When they emerge, they don't fit perfectly. Another area is securities laws. And so when they don't fit perfectly, it actually becomes a place where bad actors start to commit securities fraud. And there's been a lot of examples of that. The intersection between banking and traditional infrastructure and this crypto infrastructure, there's a bridge between these two worlds. That bridge is actually a space where bad things can happen as well, especially because there aren't solid regulations in that zone of transfer between, and the banking laws as they are don't well apply. And so you end up with these things called crypto banks, and they act like on and off ramps. This is another area that has been ripe for corruption early in the days. And so the FTX collapse made a lot of news recently. For those who may have followed along. And that's one of those crypto banks. It was offshored, it was under-regulated, and it effectively was acting like a bank using customer funds to buy crypto, but they weren't actually giving crypto over to that person's private address and their keys on the blockchain. They were holding it in their blockchain crypto bank. And then they started doing some pretty shady things that a bank shouldn't do with those customers' crypto funds. And then that whole thing blew up big on the back of the large speculative bubble. And that's the last part. This is one that I don't think, relative to this question, is that bad, which is that speculation occurs. I think speculation drives innovation, but it often results in these natural bubbles where the ineffective, overhyped innovations and they may have been like not fraudsters or scammers. They were people who believed in an idea, but the idea was the wrong time, or, isn't the right shape, or the technology wasn't mature enough. And for one reason or another, a large amount of funds spill into the system because we're excited. And then the hype comes out, the bubble bursts, often because of these bad actors who were attracted into that bubble to do not so great things and not so innovative things. And so the other element is the speculation, but I kind of have a love-hate relationship with the speculation in the space because I've watched it drive some interesting innovation.
Thank you, Bryan. So what is coming up now? There was one question in the Menti, sorry, Ratna, and it was related to complexity and size. So the size of the teams. So the question is then that if you do you think that restricting the size of teams and then making teams of teams may be one way to address the complexity?
Yeah, so I mean, this is an interesting one. And I guess maybe just to anchor into the question properly, is this technique of smaller teams and team of teams, relevant to the Teal space or relevant in the DAO space? Like, how should I answer the question, or talk about both relative to this particular mechanism?
I would say more related to DAO, but then
yeah,
also,
beautiful.
Yeah.
Okay,
I
so
think the way I was phrasing the question, Bryan, is just more related to when we talk about the potential for corruption and takeover, and then when power starts having an incentive, it's usually when we get to beyond the point of complexity and when resources start aggregating, right? So what are the ways we can imagine putting checks on that, regardless of whether it's Teal or DAO?
Yeah.
I love the way you describe that. So yeah, in relation to this question, that pattern does naturally emerge within DAOs. And so when I talked about how they like top-down propagate structure, in a lot of cases, that's exactly what they're doing. They're realizing that they've got this like monolithic mess of a giant treasury and a whole bunch of voices trying to work in that governance mechanic. And they naturally started to compose teams. And they compose teams that have autonomous oversight of funds. So they start to take the treasury and actually start to like fractal it. So they fractal the treasury, they fractal the energy of the people, and they start to form those teams and nested teams that we're so familiar with as sort of the holonic maps often seen in holacracy or sociocracy. And so that happens. But one of the challenges, and I think to your point is that once those teams are formed and have their sort of autonomous thing on the go, the DAO at its root level and the major or backstop of legitimacy of decision making is still this token weighted thing. So they've empowered these teams, and these teams got some finite level of funds to go do their thing, and then they often have to come back and ask for more funds. But what I wish happened, kind of to the point of your question, and some of the dialogue I've had with Travis and John Buck, is I wish that DAOs would start to embrace that they could actually start to create a bottom-up governance, start to elect representatives from these autonomous teams, and start to give more mandate and more legitimacy to that like elected governance or bottom-up team of team style governance, and sort of like reduce the power of the token weighted governance thing. And so I think this is a potential mitigation that's in alignment to your question, and it's not fully embraced yet, but the key ingredients are there in DAOs. And so I think you're onto something. I've been sensing into it too with others, but yeah, there's some challenges in going all the way there. Not to mention getting people to zoom in on that when they're very enamored with their new toy, the token weighted governance.
Thank you. Question answered, Ratna? Perfect. So there's really a lot discussion in the chat, and I mean, what strikes me a bit is one comment from Alexander that DAO, a tool is a tool, a nice system, but it won't solve any problem if you don't implement the whole mindset and ethics around. And I know, Bryan, that we were talking about the difference or the analogies between Teal and DAO ahead of the session. And you said that in DAO, what really struck you is that the people have the mindset. So, and this is so a little bit contradictory to what is written down here. So maybe you can give your perspective a little bit on this.
Yeah, I sort of feel like all communities are diverse. And I believe in this statement of the mindset needing to match up. And I think that kind of speaks to that slide of like some of the failures of Teal. Like, I think in some organizations, there's Teal theater, as I like to refer to it, or Teal signaling. And it's like, they're declaring, hey, we're going Teal, but like the people participating, particularly those who actually have the power and are trying to transfer it into the organization, are saying what they would like to do and probably would really like to do that, but their actions and habits aren't actually doing it. And so anyways, zooming back out to the idea that there's diversity within the Teal organizational, Teal organizations I've encountered, there's diversity within DAOs in terms of mindset of the people who show up and add energies to the network or steer the network in the early days. But one thing is that the many of the early participants in the blockchain space were so excited about these decentralized technologies and how important it was that they were built in such a way that no node in the network had power over another and power was not centralized, etc. There was a natural ethos that existed within some of the early participants in this space and the early creators of DAOs, etc. But over time, all kinds have been attracted and all kinds are participating. And yes, the health of a DAO is very much the health of the early instigators, that the patterns, whether healthy patterns and mindsets exist within the early instigators of the network.
Thanks. So there are a couple of hands ups. So I would, ask people just maybe to unmute themselves and to communicate directly. We have 10 minutes left, and I think we can continue also in the spatial room. I will share the link to this later. So I don't know who was first. Yeah, please.
I'll just shoot. Bryan, super good. You woke, I was really thinking I would fall asleep by now, but you've kind of really woken us up. And I love the conversation here with Dima and Alexander and everybody on the chat. Super. I just want to, I'm going to keep it short because we only have 10 minutes, but I don't believe that you're interpreting Conway's law correctly. I do not believe that technology drives organization in the way you describe it. And having implemented Agile in companies of 50,000 plus people, it is not the internet driving Agile. I think, as Dima and others suggested, in reality, all the work that we had to do was on culture, right? Getting the legacy technology and the backlogs right. Frankly, that was the minor part of the work that we did. But I think there's some fundamental challenges here that I just want to throw to you. I think that there are some limitations in your comparison between DAOs and Teal, because the decentralized authority in DAO, I actually don't think that's the case in Teal. There is no central authority in terms of a single control holder, but there is a central authority in regards to an ideology, a belief system. And if we look at Hire as an example of an ecosystem that uses smart contracts, at least what the CEO of Hire is always sustaining is that the common culture is really creating the trust, whereas your trust machine is only creating control. And you come into all the challenges with being able to create complete contracts. And I think from psychological research, we see a lot that complete contracts erode predisposition to trust. So in reality, you have a little bit of a contradiction in full control on the one hand, but that limits trust. And then your central authority creates a governance mechanism whereby the token holders are the people making decisions, which is also not the by advice governance process that Lalou is advocating in his book, right? So I think if we went component by component, what's the governance? What's the relationship between the individuals? What's the relationship between fragmentation, autonomy on the one hand, and integration, kind of centralization of a creed system, a shared goal? On the other hand, we would find lots of subtle differences. So would love to sit down and have further conversations. I'll leave it here.
Yeah, it's absolutely beautiful. I'll try to do a blitz on it, but like, yeah, I think I appreciate your comments regarding Conway's law. I think the one sort of like challenge, that I would put forward or sort of yes and on that is like, yeah, you're 100% correct in challenging it the way you did. But I think, the Agile Manifesto, I believe that there's a pretty strong relationship between web-based software development and the Agile Manifesto, not necessarily about backlog grooming and patterns, et cetera, and yes, there's a lot of work to do a agile transformation with an organization. It's not like software naturally drove that. I think what I was getting at was the idea that when internet based development emerged, it provoked people to ask a question around the incumbent methods of organizing. And they started to talk and have discourse with one another about it. And so I think that technology as provocation for self-reflection is maybe more what I was going after, and I oversimplified it or overextended Conway. So thank you for calling me on it. The other stuff, oh man, I mean, it's just, there's so much there. That is incredibly rich. And, with the time that we have available, I really want to embrace it, but struggle to be honest. I feel as though some of the points that you bring forward, like the higher one, for example, my natural reaction when I heard it, like my first thought in my head was, yeah, trust is being created in a different way here. And I don't know, my first theory around it, not someone who's immersed in the higher network, is that like somebody of influence declared a pattern, tried the pattern, and then the trust is that the pattern has like kind of almost like it's trusted because it's happened a number of times and we see the pattern, and then as new people are invited in, we trust the pattern will continue. It is theoretically possible if somebody of strong influence could violate that pattern in some sort of subtle or nuanced way and start to shift that pattern. We could call that like a successful mutation of behavior, maybe, but it might be a really unsuccessful one. What is a unique property of the smart contracts is that we have to actually agree to change that. Otherwise, like you said, it's control. It is agreed to control. And in some ways that's interesting to me. I don't know what the limitations are or the shadow sides. It's very early days for my thoughts around this, but I have been slightly attracted to the idea of some semblance of agreed to control that we can choose to change together. And so, yeah, those are some quick reactions. There's so much more that you raised that I just like, yeah, it would be fun to chat and learn from that discourse together.
So anyone else? I see still raised hands.
Dean, I think you're before me.
Oh, sure. After the complexity of the last conversation, I'm not sure that my basic ones really have that much of a place, and I feel like I'm just mostly in the way of people talking about really interesting things. Mine was about, I had a little moment where I specifically got into playing games with my brother to have the online community experience with avatars. Like, I was like, how do I do this? And for me, I had that reminder again, as like you talked about building trust with avatars of people in a sense. But then I had the thing of like, well, like I do this in organizations and most people are sort of turning up as some kind of organizational avatar a bit. Anyway, where emotions are kept out and there is this facade. And so for me, it's just like an extension of that. So I was reminded of that. And that was a thank you. I think there's something in it about responsibility and consistency a little bit, which is that I find so my brother got me into this freaking gaming clan and I'm like, oh, okay, this is fun. I don't know, I found people unpredictable would probably be the best way to do it. It's sort of like, because there was a bit of a distance, I found often people could kind of like turn up and throw themselves around, sometimes in the worst way of bringing yourself, because there was, I don't know, I think there was something in there about responsibility, which was interesting for me. And I'm not saying that's restricted only to online. It did seem that like, maybe it's like when you're driving a car and people will get angrier because they don't have to be face to face with people or have that real sort of social contract there. It was sort of like that distance could create a lot more volatility in how people showed up, which I thought was interesting, talking about trust. I'm not sure if you have anything that you think about. No,
this is something that I often like to contemplate, and yeah, thank you for the note of your own shared experience with your brother. And I think there is a shadow side to pseudo anonymity, and it's that if there aren't responsibilities and there isn't something reinforcing that responsibility, then you end up with the tragedy of the commons in a different way. It's people showing up and kind of like destroying the energy and not allowing space and safety for, a more heart-to-heart connection. And so, yeah, that's a thing. And I think it really comes down to the healthy communities that I've been in have ways of collectively trying to reinforce responsibility. But that's interesting because that's human based. It's not like a smart contract. And this is where I feel as though Teal practitioners who have been in the messiness of human to human interaction could really bring some experiences and lessons to these communities when they encounter those elements, because they often start out in a really excited, high energy place, and all it takes is someone to start to test the boundaries of that. And if there isn't a mechanism for conflict resolution, I've seen them naturally emerge. They look a lot like Teal patterns. Of the Ombuds Guild, for example, in Bankless DAO that I'm in, is a really neat group of people to help facilitate, not arbitrate or mediate in the case of peer-to-peer conflict in the digital organization. So, but thank you for your share.
No, and I'll tuck my second one away because I'd like Dima to get to ask his question as well.
I don't know. We have like 60 seconds.
Yes.
Maybe I'll ask it and we can continue in the chat. But I'm into DAOs. I'm into Teal, right? And I actually think I want to use blockchain technology for my accelerator in the future. But like one thing I see in DAOs, and correct me if I'm wrong, but what I see there is that they say it's decentralized, but is it really, right? Like when we talk about Teal, what we mean by decentralization, we don't mean consensus voting or governance. We mean, well, anybody can make any decision. It's decentralized by the fact that we trust everybody in our organization to do the best for the organization. So we don't need to control them, or we just trust them because they're part of the organization.
Guys.
And that is, I guess, the theme I'd like to kind of maybe start.
So we're running out of time, and I think please continue in the spatial chat room if you want to follow up on the discussion. Otherwise, I would hand it over now to the next ones.
Yep.
Thank you so much for this lively discussion, and thank you so much, Bryan.
No, thank you for hosting. I really appreciate it, and all the wonderful questions and chats in the chat.
So